In well-run organizations, either public or private, whistleblowers are prized and protected. They are the people who have the courage to speak up when they see wrongdoing. Internally, if they feel the institutional culture is welcoming, and externally, if they feel it is not to be. Whistleblowers are a major factor in fighting fraud, corruption, and unethical behavior, and also in speaking up about ill-considered institutional plans. When welcomed and protected, whistleblowing provides the opportunity to catch problems early and to make it possible, often to prevent serious harm or damage. Organizations that encourage employees to report concerns and supports them if they do, both gain trust and help create an open and honest culture that has multiple benefits for all. Regrettably, in Canada, our federal public sector whistleblower protection law was found by the International Bar Association in a study several years ago. It was studying whistleblower protection laws in 37 major countries. Canada was tied for last place in its protection for whistleblowers. But what about in the private sector in Canada, which is our subject tonight? I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Centre for Free Expression, and this evening we have a truly impressive panel of experts on whistleblower protection in Canada's private sector. But before I introduce them, I want to acknowledge that the land in which I'm speaking to you tonight is the territory of many nations: the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's event, which are Transparency International Canada and the Whistleblowing International Network. And now our panel. First, I'd like to introduce Dave Chu. Dave is the head of Integrity, Remediation, and Monitoring at AtkinsRéalis. AtkinsRéalis is Canada's largest engineering services and construction organization with more than 38,000 employees in 50 or more countries. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Jim, for the wonderful introduction and the opportunity to talk about a topic that's dear to me.
Well, we're happy you're with us. Our second panelist is Andre Moniz. Andre is the head of the Office of the Whistleblower, Relationships and Emerging Issues for the Ontario Securities Commission. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate the opportunity to also be here and speak to this very important issue.
Well, we're glad to have you. The third panelist is Michelle Wood-Tweel. Michelle is Vice President, Regulatory Affairs of CPA Canada, the organization of Canada's Chartered Professional Accountants. Welcome, Michelle.
Good evening, Jim. Thanks very much. And to the co-panelists, delighted to be with you.
And the moderator for this impressive panel is Sandy Boucher. Sandy is a senior fellow of the Centre for Free Expression and leads investigations in cybersecurity practices at Doane Grant Thornton. Sandy is one of Canada's leading experts on whistleblower protection. Welcome, Sandy.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for the introductions. I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a long time, so with your permission, we'll get started.
Could I just first explain the format to the audience?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. So our format tonight is Sandy and the panel are going to have a conversation for 45, 50 minutes or so, at which point we're going to turn to the audience for any questions you may have. There will be a Q&A session. And in this version of Zoom, if you want to ask a question, we hope you do. We really encourage you to ask these questions. It's rare that you're going to have a chance to ask such a group of experts questions about these issues. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button that you can press. And at any point when you're listening to the interview or the conversation and a question comes up, please feel free just to click on that button and just write out your question. And when Sandy and the panel turn to the audience, they will ask, sorry, I'm losing my time. They'll ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the center, to read out the first question, and then the panel will answer it, and at which point they'll turn to the second question and so forth. So we really do encourage you to ask questions, the panel's looking forward to responding to your questions. So click on that Q&A button and just write down the questions as they come along. Don't wait till we turn to the audience to do that. That's all for me, so I'll turn it over to the four of you.
Lovely. Thanks, Jim. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. As you probably know, some of you will at least, the CFE has done a lot of work over the years on whistleblowing writ large. And a fair amount of that has been focused on the government side and trying to help laws and trying to help governments, as well as a lot of awareness. One of the things that struck me a few years ago is that it's very difficult to get governments to change course. And in this country, that has proven to be the case. But I also looked at it from a different point of view. We've got something like 20 million people in the workplace here. And we know that the government servants have laws, which we've heard don't work. And we know that the publicly traded companies, as we're going to hear from Andre, there's requirements to have some of these things. And so what that means is something like 5.5% of employees in Canada have some kind of whistleblowing law, roughly. Most of them don't work, but that means there's maybe 19 million people that don't have any coverage at all. But what we also know, and you're going to hear from our experts, is that in the private sector, a lot of organizations come up with this: whistleblowers are important, their information is vital, whistleblower programs work, they help us to figure out what's going on, and particularly if it's wrong, to catch it early. They help us build that trust with all of our stakeholders. They're a great idea and they work and they're cheap. And so a lot of organizations in the private sector have moved in that direction. We're going to hear about that. But also, I'm going to ask our experts about some of the other things that I see. And there are, in the world these days, there are global best practices, how to have the best laws, how to, have the best whistleblower protection and best practices all around. And we've done a lot of work on some of those elements. And what we're beginning to see is that some of those best practices, global best practices, they may not be there in our government laws, but they are starting to pop up in the private sector. And I personally think that's pretty exciting. So without any further ado, let's get to it and ask our panel members what they think. Michelle, if I may, I'd like to start with you. And I'd like to ask you to give your view. I know that you also have done a lot and had a lot to do with whistleblowing internationally and with governments. But how do you see whistleblowing in the private sector in Canada? What's working well? What do we need to do? And how do we compare to other jurisdictions?
Thanks very much, Sandy. So that's a big question that you've just asked, and I'll take a couple of seconds to answer it and go in different directions. One, talking about what I think is going particularly well, and then also, where there are plenty of space for room for improvement, because this is a journey. And I think that's what we know about whistleblowing. It's not an end state that you can easily get to. It takes time, and it's within legal and regulatory frameworks that exist, and you have to find your pathway to it. So one of the things that I guess I would say about private sector and what's going well is where organizations have taken the initiative to put whistleblowing programs and potentially protections in place out of their own volition. So not necessarily a regulatory or a legal requirement. And usually when you see that being done, I think it's because they're recognizing that it's a valid part of a risk management process for an organization. This is a way to both analyze what you're at risk for and try and protect the organization against that. So that's one thing that I think is good to note. Another one is where, folks have identified that this is integral to their business integrity. And they've identified that this could even be, a deterrent to wrongdoing, to simply have in place a whistleblower program where people have an understanding that if they see something and they need to say something, they have a way to do it. So they're educated to know it exists, they're educated to be able to use it, and they have a sense that it will be well received if they do report it. So I think that's another one around business integrity that is really important. I think there's an element of it that speaks to best practice. And that could be because, organizations are seeing others within their sector doing something along these lines, their peers or competitors. It could be because of the oversight by their board of directors that are encouraging them to take this step from a governance perspective. But that's another thing that I think is good. It's a good development. And then I think ultimately there are people that just recognize this is potentially good business. because there's the opportunity to learn what's happening earlier than you might otherwise learn about it. It also gives you then the opportunity to fix it or remedy it before it becomes more damaging or more serious in nature. And last but not least, I think it's also where public or private sector has recognized that there's a value to whistleblowers being recognized with a way to speak up. And this is, where they can be recognized for saying what they're saying. It will be investigated. They will hear back how it's turned out. But there's a response to the fact that they have a concern that they've actually highlighted for the organization. And we know, and I think that, Sandy, you'd be quick to enforce this with some stats, but we know that whistleblowers, by and large, find more that goes wrong, especially from a financial perspective within organizations, than do other means such as audits or internal audit processes. So the value of whistleblowers coming forward in an organization are tremendous. So I think all of those things speak to what is going well within the private sector when there's this initiative to say, this is good for my business, I want to do this, and people are putting it in place. There are also, though, private sector entities that have requirements that are coming from legal or regulatory requirements in Canada and maybe elsewhere. So if they're doing business internationally, they may have to comply with laws and regulations in those other jurisdictions. So there could be reasons why they're having to do that. And I think that that speaks to another area, which is, the improvements that could be made here in Canada as we look and reflect at our own situation. So one of the things I think you've highlighted is that we have a bit of an unlevel playing field in terms of who's covered, who may not be. There's a patchwork quilt of where these requirements show up in laws and regulations. So there's perhaps not great clarity around where these provisions exist, how people are covered, how they might be protected if protection exists. So that's something certainly that I think from a Canadian landscape perspective could be done better. And that's further complicated, I might say, by being multi-jurisdictional. So Canada has a complex makeup just by nature of our country. And that's one of the things that in this area as well makes it a little more complicated. I think the other thing I would comment on is that Canadians as a people and Canada as a culture needs to embrace the work that goes into being a whistleblower and respecting the value of a whistleblower. These are people that take on risk. It takes a tremendous amount of confidence to do this. And most studies that look at whistleblowers will tell you the reason that they did it is because they couldn't live with not saying something. So they didn't do it for the fame, the glory, the reward, or anything else that people might sometimes want to think. It's because morally they couldn't live with the situation and felt compelled to come forward to share the information with someone that they hoped would take action. So I think in this conversation tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground. But Sandy, I hope that opens it up for talking about some of the things that are going well and where improvements might be found.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I know already I've got a couple of notes about things that we can come back to in a minute. But let's just pick up on one of the threads that you've mentioned, and that is that although the private sector doesn't have overarching laws, and because of our legal structure of the way the provinces and the feds are organized, that's not a simple thing. There are countries where you have one law and everybody's covered. That's not going to work here. But as you've also said, there are areas where it is necessary. And one of the ones that I'm really keen on is our securities laws. And amongst our group at the CFE, I've been talking since 2018 when Ontario put some of the global best practice elements in their laws. And so, Andre, I wonder if you could explain, Ontario's securities laws and the whistleblower clauses, and what do they do and what's happening in the private sector. I know we have a lot to talk about in the detail, but maybe you could start by giving us the big picture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is, like I said, a fantastic topic that's very much dear to my heart, because certainly we at myself, in terms of my current role, I do deal with whistleblowers every day. I do deal with investigators and prosecutors that deal with the issues that whistleblowers are bringing forward. So really happy to speak about that. And certainly with respect to the framework that we're sort of established in Ontario, I think it's really helpful, very much touching upon many of the points that Michelle mentioned in terms of the impetus and the motivation and the rationale behind a lot of this framework. It is very much a recognition. It makes business sense. It makes the capital markets better. And it's a recognition that whistleblowers add value and certainly perform a public service that benefits everyone. And I should mention before I go too much further is, the usual caveat that I think everyone sort of hears about it when we attend these sort of speaking events. The views that I express are certainly my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Ontario Securities Commission. And even though I am a lawyer by background, please don't hold it against me. What I do mention today should not be taken as legal advice, and it does allow us to sort of have a good, frank, great conversation. So thank you very much for that. But before I go into too much of the legal landscape, I do want to sort of go in a little bit about why we sort of established this program. Why do we have these laws in place? Certainly, in any sort of regulatory environment, we want to find out this information as soon as possible, because at the end of the day, we want to stop the harm earlier. We want to protect investors in our context, and certainly make sure that businesses function in a fair and appropriate manner. So there is a recognition behind a lot of our laws that wherever there's misconduct going on in the capital markets, there's a good chance there's someone there who has witnessed it, or someone who actually is able to tell us where the evidence is that you could prove that sort of misconduct. And so the question becomes in terms of how do we incentivize those people to come forward? And certainly it's those laws. But I should mention before we talk about the laws, we do have an award framework. An award framework in place that's very important because we recognize that whistleblowers do take on risk. It does require courage. There are certain, social or business or psychological costs that are involved. So we at the Ontario Securities Commission, when we started our whistleblower program back in 2016, it was very much recognizing that we are the first paid program in the security space, recognizing that whistleblowers have value and should be accorded such. We don't look at it as a bounty. We look at it as recognition, if you will. And that's important. And how do we know it's working? Because we've paid out over $11 million just in Ontario for whistleblowers. And these aren't just whistleblowers in Ontario. These are whistleblowers around the world, which is quite considerable when you think about it, because at the end of the day, we pay for timely, credible, specific tips that have real value in stopping harm and holding people accountable. So in terms of the laws that are sort of structuring or framing, if you will, the program, they're important because we want to make sure that any successful whistleblower program incentivizes people to come forward, not just because of an award, because they can be protected. So these laws are really very much designed to protect whistleblowers. So since 2016, it has been a breach of Ontario securities law for a company to take a reprisal against a whistleblower for reporting on potential securities law violations. And that's important to make sure that's for whistleblowers to be able to be comfortable to coming forward. So to get to that point, we've defined reprisal very broadly. So I should mention, it's not just a whistleblower coming forward that they're protected, even reflecting or thinking about coming forward. If they're talking about, should I come forward or should I not come forward? Just thinking about it enough affords that protection on the whistleblower. And in terms of reprisal, the reprisal in the normal sense, we always think about termination, but it's more than that. Reprisal can be in the form of intimidation, coercion. It can be in the form of a threat, demotion, some sort of adverse effect. So we've defined it very broadly, and again, really important because we want to make whistleblowers comfortable to come forward. And these laws also recognize that there are silencing provisions in employment agreements. So how do we deal with that? So in Ontario, the securities law have effectively rendered silencing provisions void and non-enforceable. So whistleblowers are comfortable to come forward, recognizing that they will not be able to be sanctioned, if you will, by virtue of a silencing provision in an employment agreement. Lastly, the other thing I also want to highlight in terms of a law that sort of protects whistleblowers is a form of an immunity provision from a civil action. So the Ontario Securities Act actually puts in place protection for whistleblowers who come forward and share information from being civilly sued by virtue of just coming forward. That has often had a chilling effect when people have thought to themselves, well, you know, I could be sued, I could be taken to court. The Securities Act recognizes that and puts those sort of protections in place. There are some nuances there that we can certainly talk about, but at the end of the day, that's sort of the general framework that's in place. That's important to make whistleblowers feel comfortable coming forward.
Lovely. That's great, Andre. Thank you. And I know that some of the more specific, it's a very practical. I love the idea that we've got broad definitions and broad coverage, because many of the laws, or all of the laws almost here, are very, very narrow and very focused. And if you don't fit the exact rule, then I'm sorry, we can't help you. So that's really important. And we're going to talk about some of the cases in a minute where we've really seen for the first time actual protection for whistleblower retaliation. But there's another side to the practical. And Dave, I want to come to you. Dave spent a lot of years working at complex whistleblower programs and dealing with whistleblowers. There are best practices, Dave. Could you tell us a bit about, you know, what are these best practices and what are the essentials, the basics that you must have for a good whistleblower program?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I'm going to use a lot of example from my company to sort of explain what the best practices are. But just before we go there, I just want to maybe add a little bit to Michelle's point about what's incentivizing companies in putting in a whistleblower program. For us, you know, reputational cost is huge. So being able to know things that before it gets blown up in the media, it's a huge incentivizing benefit for the company to have a whistleblower program. And secondly, what we find from a cultural survey, and not very many people talk about it, is actually employee retention. We find that especially younger employees that are just out of university and started working in a workforce, they really do appreciate a company that has a good whistleblowing program or a good integrity program in place, and they actually cherish that, and it actually helps with employee retention. So in terms of best practices, so I look at it a little bit differently. I think a whistleblower program is a cornerstone of a wider, better program. For me, or for our company, we built our integrity program upon three pillars, right? One is prevent, second is detect, and lastly is respond. So for prevention, that's really policies such as, you know, the company's code of conduct. So having a governance framework set up to sort of drive your integrity program. Second are procedures and controls, right? So those are the things that, you know, help company from preventing things from happening. And then lastly from that is training. A lot of times, you know, people will have policies in place, but they don't do any training. So sometimes I would see companies that have a whistleblowing policy and it's part of their employees' handbook, and all they require is for a new joiner to sign off on acknowledging reading it, and that's it. So for us, we have annual code of conduct certification, and also number of different mandatory trainings throughout the year that people need to complete to make sure that it's on top of mind. In terms of detect, obviously, you know, there are internal audits, and we do proactive integrity reviews as well to find things that are not being reported. But most importantly, it's our Speak Up program, which is our whistleblowing program. So having a good duty report policy in place is great, and having, you know, a anonymous third party phone line for people to report allegations, that's great. But I think recently Ethics came out with a benchmark report, and it actually says that people are 6 times more likely to report to the managers than using a reporting line. So that's why we always fall back on the training, especially for managers, to ensure that they know how to handle people that are coming forward to talk about it, things that they see. And lastly is respond. So respond is really the investigation part, and then the remedial action. The importance of having investigations and then whatever the outcome is, having remedial action, is to show people that you're actually acting upon what they're reporting. It's one thing for them to be able to report something, but if they don't see any changes, people are not going to be reporting things. So a lot of times people would say, "Oh, I've got a policy in place, a whistleblowing policy in place," but no one ever calls that number, right? That's because you don't have a framework to make sure that if someone reports something, that things are going to be looked at. So that's really important. So those are the key things to have a good whistleblower program, is really having a base or foundation of a wider integrity or governance framework to actually drive that.
Lovely, thanks, Dave. And I'd like to throw you another question that's part of that. We talk about structure, policies, controls, and a system, and phone lines, and all of these things. But in my experience, there's two primary reasons why people might decide not to do it. One is that they fear retaliation, and we're going to come back to retaliation discussion in a minute. And the
Yeah.
second one is that they don't think you're going to do anything about it. And I define those two things ultimately as trust. So you can build all this stuff. This is the old SEC. If we find your anti-corruption and your whistleblower policy in cellophane on the shelf, you failed, because it's got to be used, it's got to be trained, it's got to be believed. Can you talk just a little bit about some of the things that you do to try and help? Like, how do you promote trust in the system?
Yeah. Trust is core to an integrity program. For us, we do a lot of things that to actually build up the trust. So everyone talks about tone from the top, right? You have your CEO having a statement about, we take integrity seriously. We listen to all the whistleblowers. That's great, but he's not the one that's going to be receiving the allegations. He's not the one that people from the ground will go to talk about, because if they do, it's their last sort of step, right? Because they feel that no one's hearing them from the middle, and then they go to the top. By that time, it's too late. So for us, our focus is actually on middle management, and there's a lot of things that we do in terms of training, communications, to ensure that middle management is displaying ethical behavior, and being open to talking with individuals. And I'm not talking about the manager, having to talk about integrity every meeting or all the time. It's just, how do they approach their employees, making sure that they're open and not snapping back at them when they raise something. Those are little things that, the behavioral that they need to learn and to practice in order for the speak up culture to drive the speak up culture. And one of the things that we along with actually health and safety, that really focuses on is psychological safety. So we really focus on being able to speak up and not fear any types of retaliation. As Andre has said, retaliation comes in very different forms, and in a corporate setting, termination is sort of a death sentence, right? But there are things such as, even you go out to lunch with your team every day, and then all of a sudden you get stopped not getting invited to lunches, or team meetings that you're in every day, and all of a sudden you're not getting invited to those team meetings. Those subtle things always play a part in it. And in terms of retaliation, and we actually build in a lot of retaliation controls as part of our investigation process. So when we interview someone, either the reporter or witnesses or even the person of interest, we always stress about non-retaliation. And then after the interviews are done, or after the investigation is done, um, uh, uh, we actually have to reach out to each of the individuals that we've spoken to make sure they're not being retaliated, and that they understand what types of what retaliation is, and we explain to them, and make sure that nothing's happening to them. And then afterwards, we actually have a survey that gets sent out every 6 months on the investigations that we've done previously, and those would include questions such as, are you being retaliated against, or are you feeling safe where you're working? So those kind of things that we put in place.
That's
Can
great.
I sort of jump in there, Sandy?
Yeah, go ahead, Andre.
Just to build on a couple of things that Dave said from the perspective of what we've seen. Like one of the concerns that was expressed when we started a whistleblower program, just on the discussion of trust that you mentioned, was that our whistleblower program or whistleblower programs in general undermine internal reporting, because we're inviting people, especially when you're offering an award, you're inviting people to certain bypass their company's internal and coming straight to the commission. But we've actually structured our program because to encourage and incentivize people to report internally first. From our perspective, who better is in a better position to identify, detect, stop misconduct, and put in controls to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so, I mean, as you're talking about in trust, there's so many times when people have submitted whistleblower tips to us, we've asked them, did you escalate internally? Did you report internally? And quite often people do. I mean, people do report internally. But the next question we ask is, what happened after that? And they'll say, I don't know. I never heard back or anything. I was really just raising a question, and I'm not sure if I'm right. Well, whistleblowers don't have to be right. They just have to, have some reasonable belief something's wrong and is worth raising. The other thing I also wanted to sort of support in terms of what Dave was saying is the training part. Absolutely. You can have the best policies in the world, the best procedures in the world, but if you don't have that training aspect to it, and thank you, Dave, for going into some detail about that, because that's really important. At the end of the day, we've found the middle management, we've found people who affect the reprisals are the immediate supervisor, if you will. And understanding what a reprisal means, and it is important. It is naturally broad, because it does impact people in a real way. So they do have to be aware of the conduct, aware of their actions. So I just wanted to in terms of the things that Dave has talked about, we have seen it as well on this side of the corporation.
That's great. Thank you, Andre. And I was going to echo some of that, and that having the system and everything and it all looking nice and shiny is not good enough. You have to have all of that detailed work. And there's just beginning to be studies. This question of, well, did you report it internally? And I've always been troubled. I work with what I call the coalition of the willing. It's what we're talking about here. A lot of organizations say this is the right thing to do. This is good business. This is good ethics. Let's just do it, right? Do we need laws? No, we're just going to do it. And so the idea that all these people report and nothing happens, and I've just started to see some of the early studies coming globally where they say, well, when you reported, who did you report to? And what they actually found was that a number of things. Number one, in many cases, the people that received the report didn't actually perceive that they were getting a whistleblower complaint. I've like the three of us, and Michelle, you probably have too, but we've talked to an awful lot of whistleblowers, hundreds and hundreds. And sometimes they're stressed and they're really difficult to understand and it's complex. And so the idea that they might not have just laid out, look, here's what you need to know, and you're like, got it, let's fix it. I thought that was interesting. Number two, you talk about training and working with managers. I love that point, the speak up environment. But you've got to have someone that says, hold on a minute, this is someone trying to tell me something. What are they trying to tell me? And making sure that it gets received. And then once that happens, you still have to have the process that it goes through. And I spend a lot more of my time now working with clients on the process and how to make sure it's done right and how to hear things. And so a lot of the points that we've had here are just really excellent, because that's the deep ingrained culture. It's not just, I got a lovely shiny policy. So this is good for this piece. We've got a couple of other big topics. Michelle, I want to come back to you and go up to the top again. I'm really passionate about this, and I know we all are. I know you are. And I wonder if you can't have a law, click your fingers, and we've all got whistleblower protection. It's brilliant. There are other ways that we could look at this. And one of the ways I look at it, well, who else, should we be thinking about? Oh, we've got public companies. We've got, what about financial institutions? We know that's another area where we're beginning to see organizations and governments coming out with some better laws. But who else? Professionals, CPAs, lawyers, engineers. Where else do you think we need to be talking to people? Because we're trying to get folks to think about, this stuff is good. This stuff works. These guys will make it work every day. Who else needs to hear that message? Where should we be thinking about?
So, Sandy, you've asked me another huge question. I mean, and I'm going to answer broadly, because I am passionate about this, and I think if you let your mind wander about it for any length of time around how much we all have to frankly be thankful for every day that something isn't going wrong, but also thankful for the people who do point it out when they do. Name a sector that it somehow wouldn't matter. And I'm hard pressed to think of very many. You know, you think of food safety, you think of transportation, you think of the medical environment, including pharmaceuticals. You know, it's anything to me that is speaking to the safety and security of Canadians. And that's a really wide landscape when we look at it. So I think what we can see in what Canada has tried to do, and that's both at federal and provincial levels, is go to areas that would be considered of higher risk, to try and address those higher risks in the public interest and try and protect the public from issues that are seen to be you know, very high risk. But there's lots of room. And I think that's the point that you're getting at for other areas to be scoped into having whistleblower protection and whistleblowing channels. So if knowing my background as being a CPA and talking about financial scenarios, I think one of the areas that we do have to be concerned about, because there's an evolving risk landscape that's taking place globally and certainly in Canada, just consider fraud alone. Consider the developments of technology on an ongoing basis, on a daily basis, whether it's, you know, new platforms, whether it's crypto, whether it's AI, you know, it's just evolving rapidly. So financial issues, I think, are ones that I could speak to, I guess, with some knowledge, and particularly when we look at financial crime. And one of the ones that I have the most experience in looking at the landscape in Canada is in respect of anti-money laundering. And this is one where I think we can sort of provide an example of back to our complex multi-jurisdictional environment that we operate in Canada. So we can have a federal law that speaks to anti-money laundering. And in fact, we of course do, the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act, the PCML-TFA. It can provide indemnification at a federal level, but then you recognize that depending on who you are making a report and how that federal indemnity might apply to you, you may not have civil protection in a provincial court of law if you are sued. And then you discover there's a gap between the provincial and the federal legislation. They just aren't meeting up. So I think that's one of the areas where I think we can say that, you know, we need to incorporate avenues for more people to utilize whistleblowing channels to be able to report on financial crime. In some jurisdictions, it's been done very surgically in specific pieces of legislation, such as it certainly has been done in the US in relation to anti-money laundering. But there are other jurisdictions where it's been done very broadly, and it's been done more from a perspective of public interest. And if you have a disclosure to make that's related to the public interest, it can be brought under legislation that is broader in nature. So one of the things that we certainly have learned is that there's no one answer here in terms of how jurisdictions approach this. But financial crime is a real risk globally. It certainly is a risk confronting Canada. And it's one, I think, where we have to embrace more people and sectors into the opportunity of reporting what they see before harm is done. So that would be one of my answers, I think, to your question, Sandy. And Dave, I think you've had the most popular question of the night so far. So I just want to actually add my 2 cents to what you just answered. And that is that I think the other point is the review of whistleblower protection programs and channels to see if they're working, right? Because Sandy, to your point, the glossy cellophane wrapped piece, if you're getting no reports, then that doesn't mean that it's actually working. Nothing's happening. It might just not be actually, you know, availing you of the information you wish it would. So regular reviews of how that system is working and reflections with hindsight about things that have gone on in the organization and why it didn't come through a whistleblower channel, I think is the other thing that would be really important from an organizational perspective.
Well, that's lovely. I don't think we've got nearly long enough to talk about all the stuff I want to ask you guys, but I'm going to mention briefly, we started this working group, and both Dave and Michelle are on our working group for the private sector. Michelle and the CPA Canada and a global group have created an excellent document which will be available in the materials that come out tomorrow about understanding whistleblower protections. There's another one we put there from our colleagues at Transparency International. And I think, Andre, we've all got little bits that we're going to put to give you links to some of these materials. It's a really big topic. But what I want people to start thinking about is exactly what Michelle said, like, yeah, everywhere could do it, but what could we do now? Where could we start? How can we? And we want people just to start talking about this and start looking for things that they could do. But what I'd like to do now is, my view, having done this for a very long time, is that we have laws, we have systems, programs, we have all these things, and we're trying to govern and make successful a really simple transaction, which is someone saying, excuse me, but there's a problem over there. The act of doing that has had enormous consequences. Any of you that see some of the stuff that I post, you look at whistleblowers in South Africa, where they're being killed every month. High profile, brave people who are CPAs, who are auditors, who are lawyers, who are people working all over the place, and they're being murdered. We don't have that here. We do have other things. What's going on here? And the way I look at it is that we create these protected channels, and we need the protected channels. You don't always need them. Why do we need them? Because we have retaliation. A lot of what we do is, whistleblowing is simple. You just tell someone, right? The problem is if you tell them and the bad guys find out, then sometimes it doesn't go quite so well. So I want us to talk about retaliation. And Andre, I'm going to come back to you because we've got these two lovely cases, particularly the new one. There is virtually no law in this country except for the Ontario Securities Act, which really talks about retaliation and prevent retaliation and compensate for retaliation and deal with it. In most places, there's nothing. And so could you talk to us about some of the things that have gone on? Because as far as I know, those two cases you're going to tell us about are the only ones in this country where someone has made a finding of retaliation and they've done something about it.
Absolutely, and happy to do so. I mean, I think these are really important cases because they definitely send a message. They send a message not only to organizations, but they send a message to whistleblowers as well, that there is protection out there. There are systems in place that look out for you, and what you're doing and what we're trying to incentivize and encourage and protect you to do is important. Interestingly enough, and I don't think we certainly didn't plan it this way, Sandy, a civil case, one of the first ones that interpreted the anti-retaliatory provisions in the Securities Act came out just last month. We couldn't have planned it better, but certainly happy to talk about that because there's some really critical takeaways from that. The case was McPherson and Global Growth Assets. The decision was from the Ontario Court just, like I said, last month. I won't go too much into the facts of the case, but I do want to focus on some of the takeaways or some of the key pronouncements, if you will, that the court said that I think should give whistleblowers some encouragement and employers something seriously to think about. One in particular is with respect to whistleblowers who are concerned that when they do get a reprisal, for example, a termination or some kind of other disciplinary action, the employer may refer to it as because of their performance or because of something that they have done that's outside of whistleblowing. The court has said you cannot take a reprisal against an employee even if a portion of what they've done is related to whistleblowing. They may not be a great performer. They may have done something that's not necessarily within the confines of their employment agreement for which you want to effect a reprisal, but you can't do it for whistleblowing. And in this particular case, that's what the company had said. The company said the termination was because of poor performance, but the court said all they needed to do was tie it to a portion of which was the reporting, and that was good enough for the court. And they awarded the whistleblower in that case. So that was really important. The other thing that was also important, because the Ontario securities laws have defined it this way, there's a reverse onus. The law recognizes the power differential, if you will. So once an adverse effect has happened to an employee, the law puts the onus on the employer to prove that it wasn't because of whistleblowing. And in this case, the facts and the evidence clearly showed there was a connection to whistleblowing, that the court didn't even need to go so far as to have the employer try and prove that what they did was not in connection with whistleblowing. The other thing that was a great takeaway from this case too was the employer did try and countersue for slander, for intentional interference. The court dismissed that. The court said clearly this is not what's going on here. This was done in bad faith and was done to effectively try and stymie, if you will, the OSC's investigation and any cooperation for it. So basically, at the end of the day, what the court has basically said was, we recognize what you did was important. We recognize what you did was for the purposes of whistleblowing. And they awarded over $5 million to this particular individual. This individual was senior, and the Act defines the remedies, double the compensation that the individual would have lost, but for the individual lost because of the termination. The other thing the court said too, which I thought was particularly good too, is there's no real duty to mitigate. We're not going to discount your award because you've taken on a new job. You were able to quickly find a new job. The court said, no, you were terminated because of whistleblowing. We are going to compensate for your loss if you had continued to be employed. And that I think is also really, really important as well.
Excellent.
The other case I just want to quickly mention too,
please,
is on the regulatory side. So that was the civil side. On the regulatory side, we had the Coin Square matter. And I won't go into too much detail about that, but I did want to highlight in that case, it was a settlement and there were admissions made by the registered entity. But at the end of the day, the settlement with respect to the reprisal was on the threat. That is, again, how I talked about in the beginning, the definition of reprisal is very broad and it's very important. The facts as it came out in this Coin Square case was the individual internal to the organization recognized there was some market manipulation going on. And so they expressed concern. They saw it continue to go on, and so they escalated it. And then the president of the organization said, okay, you know what, we're going to stop it. We're going to stop this conduct and we're going to fix this problem. And then the CEO then said, no, we need to continue. We need to continue because it's showing us some great results. And so the employee again raised it again and said, you know, this is continuing to go on. And so the message that he received was, if you better stop complaining because this is not going to bode well for your employment. So just the very threat of that was enough for the tribunal to basically say, we recognize this is part of the problem. And you can't go ahead with respect to treating whistleblowers that way.
Good, lovely. There's the two cases that we know about in Canada where courts or tribunals have made findings of retaliation. And what I love about the Ontario law is all those practical things. You're going to be eligible for up to double everything that you've lost, and we all know the damage that whistleblowers have. Think about our federal law, as Jim said, worst in the world. That tribunal has never, ever found a single case of retaliation. No retaliation in the federal government. Isn't that marvelous? Dave, I want to put this retaliation thing back to you a bit, because you said a couple of things that I think are really interesting. A lot of organizations don't, if you ask them about retaliation, they go, well, I haven't seen any retaliation. Have you seen retaliation? And you say, well, you know, do you know what retaliation is? And they say, well, you know, I read the papers. And you're like, okay, well, that's big, scary stories, but you know, what does it look like in an organization? What does it really look like? And you've talked about some of the details of what you do. It has to be recognized. It has to be tracked. It has to be responded to. It has to be investigated. Can you tell us, because it's clear that your program has built that piece in there as well. How does all of that work? Because I think that's really interesting lesson for everybody.
Yeah, in terms of retaliation, I think I spoke a little bit about it, how we baked in the retaliation piece into the investigation process. And you know, we actually go very far in protecting people that are coming up and reporting allegations, to the extent that we make sure that even in our report, the reporter's name is never mentioned, even if the reporter comes to us as non-anonymous or coming up to us just being identified, we don't even name that in there, just to make sure that we're protecting this individual. And as I said, there's some organizations that goes very far in terms of tracking along with HR, tracking the progression of individuals' career, i.e. in terms of their performance appraisals and stuff like that for the year or two after the investigation has been completed. And for us, as I said before, we during the interview stage, we remind them of retaliation. We do a 3-month checkup after investigation has been closed to make sure that he's not feeling or the person is not feeling retaliation, and then also the survey that comes 6 months in after the investigation. So that sort of covers a whole year of after the investigation has been completed to make sure that the person is not being retaliated against. And in terms of incentivization of whistleblowers, to Andre's point, we don't have a monetary incentivization for whistleblowers, but we actually have, as part of every employee's annual review, we actually have one of the core value for our company is actually integrity. So that is actually part of the employees' yearly annual review, and that has a direct impact on the person's raise for that year as well. And in terms of senior management, what we call AIP, which is their annual bonus. There's also a portion of it that's integrity related, and it also counts towards what they call the integrity enabling activities. So we actually borrowed that from health and safety, where they do health and safety enabling activities. This is integrity enabling activities. So they're actually tracked, and they have to do at least 4 different activities that sort of speaks to integrity, albeit blogs, communications during town halls, and all those things, to make sure that they exhibit a openness to talk about integrity, hence driving that speak up culture.
That's awesome. Michelle, was there anything you wanted to add on the retaliation side?
Well, I think it's just that people, in setting up programs, and certainly in managing them, they have to be hyper alert to any, information that they receive around things changing. And I think, Dave made the point, it can be relatively subtle in a way, but in a way meant to sort of freeze you out or freeze the person out such that they may make a decision to leave. I think it's quite common, frankly. So I think that's an unfortunate part. In Dave's instance, the way that their company has designed it, it sounds like they've taken great lengths to try and address it. But I do think that this is quite a common scenario that whistleblowers face. So the other part that I think ties into this, right, is when you do get to a point where there is a program that includes protection through monetary award. I think that's anticipating what a whistleblower might go through and ensuring that they are not harmed through the process of actually speaking up. So they're all interrelated, and I think that all of that has to be borne in mind as you design a program, whether there will in fact be, monetary award attached, et cetera, and how you will build a program that will protect people from being frozen out, or in fact something like being removed from an organization intentionally for the whistleblowing that has been done. I think it's all too common. Sandy, you and I have talked about people that have left the country. They've spoken up in serious scenarios, only to never be able to find the next opportunity that they were looking for in their field of their chosen profession or occupation. And in fact, it was easier to leave Canada than to stay here. That's indicative of the seriousness, that people can run into. And I think one of the other ones that I would highlight in relation to that we sometimes don't think enough about either is sort of in rural communities. Very difficult to speak up in a smaller location, and continue to do what you do, without it affecting perhaps you in that smaller community or your financial well-being in that smaller community, et cetera. So these are all things that I think as people are designing programs, they have to be, you know, ever present in their mind to consider the circumstances that the whistleblower may find themselves in, and then how do you protect against that to ensure that the right news comes forward and that people are feeling safe and secure to do so, because they won't if they don't feel that way. They will struggle with it, and a lot of people ultimately will leave the organization rather than speak. But those that do speak because they can't live with it.
Yeah, and the damage. You know, I got involved in this many years ago as a federal government whistleblower, and at the end of it all, you had 20 years and destroyed family, destroyed career, the whole thing, mental health issues. And I said, would you do it again? And he said, I know I should really say no, but you know I did it because it was the right thing to do. And the answer is yes, I would. We did a case just quickly before we open the audience questions, where it was an enormous public and civil engineering project, and somebody blew the whistle on all the corruption in the procurement. And eventually there was a public inquiry. And in that public inquiry, we found out that the whistleblower had their office door kind of spray painted and graffitied. They'd had their office trashed. When they spoke in meetings or when they entered rooms, everybody in the room would turn away from them. And if they went into the canteen and sat down, people would leave. How is it possible that people didn't know that ostracization and that unofficial retaliation was going on? It's not possible. So I was being facetious. I know you all knew that, but of course, the global stats say that something like 80% of all whistleblowers suffer some level of negative consequences. That's not a hard and fast statistic, and the range of what those things can be is different. But it is, I'm really glad that we've had an opportunity to talk about retaliation, because we're not talking about it enough. I could go on forever, but I think what we should probably do, and if you're ready, if we have questions from the audience, we'd love for you to give us one or two. And if not, then I'll think up lots of other things I want to ask.
Yeah, we do have some questions from the audience. The first question, somebody asks, what could our federal and provincial governments learn from the best private sector policies and practices to improve whistleblower protection for public sector employees?
So, Michelle or Andre, do you want to have a quick go? Again, it's another huge question. Sorry, I gave you big questions, but I think that there are some very simple things that we've talked about, which, like, hey, start somewhere.
Yeah, maybe I'll just start and open a segue, and then Andre and Dave hop on in. I think at this point, to be fair, there's been enough studying and experience built up around the world now that, you know, we're coming to ground. Maybe there are some nuances, but coming to ground on what best principles are in relation to whistleblowing programs, channels, protections, et cetera. I will add that I think some of this might evolve because technology is going to aid it going forward, right? So technological platforms that become available for whistleblowing reporting. You know, part of activity in the last 6 months or so has been working with the B20 in South Africa on integrity and compliance. And one of the ideas coming out of that is the use of AI for anonymizing whistleblowers. So technology is perhaps going to, you know, evolve with this field. But I think that there's a lot of learning that is available from the private sector and from other entities, TI, others, that have identified by studying what has taken place around the globe, what's worked and what hasn't. So, you know, when I think about, again, what is complex for governments, I think it's to bring home those best practices and try and fit those into an existing legislative and regulatory framework and make them work. So nobody should underestimate how difficult it is. But the other thing that I would say about this is it's better to get started than not. And we can't let it continue to slide because it's not advancing Canada's interests.
Yeah, that's great.
I might just quickly jump in. Certainly, in terms of two points that Michelle sort of spoke to, certainly technology has been fantastic in terms of reporting to the Securities Commission. We have an online portal, and at the end of the day, our objective is to try and get as much information as possible from the individual up front, which facilitates their ability to express themselves how they'd like to express it, but also focuses them on what we think are important things that we would want to learn from them. And so we have this dialogue, and I think a dialogue is very much an important aspect of any relationship with whistleblowers. And then in terms of also learning best practices around the world, certainly every situation is different. Every world, society or business culture can be different as well. We've learned a lot from our counterparts at the SEC. When they established their whistleblower program quite some time ago, but they have a massive market. They have a very different market, so we customized ours accordingly. The BC Securities Commission has a smaller market than us as well, and so they customized and learned from ours as well as the SEC's and curated theirs, as has Quebec and as has Alberta. So there is a recognition there that we can learn from each other, but at the same time curate and customize according to our needs.
That's great. Thank you both. Before I go on to the next question, I'd like to just tell you a story. I've done a lot of anti-corruption work, and I know Dave has too, whistleblowers giving us information. I saw this tremendous presentation by an FBI agent, grizzled old guy. He still had more hair than me, unfortunately. And people were saying, like, what do you do? Like, how do we start? And he said, you've got to have a program. We've talked about best practices. There's lots of material that we're going to give you tomorrow when you get your video of all of this. And he said, you know what you got to do? He said, start somewhere. Pick something and do something. Start somewhere. So,
so Sandy, sorry, just before you go on
ahead,
to the next,
Dave.
I just want to maybe add a little bit of what was talked about from a private sector perspective. So it's easy for companies like us, where we're multinationals and we have to adhere to other directives and legislations from other countries, and a lot of times we have a harder time trying to keep track of what new legislations is coming out and doing gap analysis to make sure that we follow that. But for us, one of the things about sharing knowledge is, let's say if we're going into a JV and the JV partner doesn't have a compliance program, or make sure that we put our compliance program into the JV, and that the JV partner then can always take that away and apply it to their company as well. And secondly, our vendors and third parties that we work with, so they have to adhere to our code of conduct. They have to do our training as well, and there has to be integrity clauses built into their to their agreements. So hence those little things, we hope that those smaller companies can take that away and then apply it on to their company as well. And we at times would mentor companies as well on, mentor smaller companies on how to put in a compliance program. We've been asked by the World Bank to help other companies to sort of put in a program that would fit what they need and and the country that they're operating in. So.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. So, Ange, could we have the next question, please?
Yeah, the next question is from David. David says, can we hear more about how organizations measure the effectiveness of their systems in terms of gaining employees' trust to come forward, mitigating wrongdoing, and protecting those who blow the whistle? For example, does anyone attempt to track the career trajectory of past whistleblowers?
That's a great question, David. Thank you. I'm going to go to Dave first, because I've done a few bits and pieces with his organization and seen some of the depths, and you've heard a little bit about it. Dave, can you talk to that, how they measure effectiveness and also tracking outcomes over time?
Yeah, we have a number of things in place. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the cultural survey, the employee cultural survey, and we always have several questions built into the cultural survey surrounding integrity, actually whistleblowing. So, are you confident that the company will act on things that someone reports about, right? Or do you feel that you're safe and protected by the company if you do report a wrongdoing? So those are the types of questions that we ask in terms of a cultural survey. And we track our stats in terms of our reporting hotline, to determine what the percentage of anonymous and non-anonymous is. So typically, from typical benchmark is about other companies are about 60% anonymous, 40% identified. For us, we're actually reversed, so we're actually 40% anonymous, 60% identified. So I'm quite proud of that, which sort of indicates people are feel safe about reporting things. So those are just a few things in relations to how we measure it. Obviously, as I said, we do surveys, we do what we call compliance control framework testing, and we do compliance risk assessments as well to make sure that people feel safe about reporting allegations that they have.
That's excellent. Andre or Michelle, did you want to add anything to that answer?
Mine would only be that concept I mentioned earlier, which is it's the rear view mirror. It's and I've done this myself when I've been in places like on a board serving or something like that. I've questioned in my own mind if something has occurred. Should we have heard of this through whistleblowing channels when we didn't? And if we didn't, then why not? So I think that's a valid question for the overseers of organizations to question. I think it's a valid question certainly for management. Issues will occur, and some never would rise to perhaps the opportunity of a whistleblower, but other ones maybe should have. And that's a good question, I think, for people to reflect on.
Great.
And I certainly agree with that. In terms of measuring the effectiveness of a good internal whistleblower program in the private sector, I mean, that's certainly something that as Michelle said at the beginning, it makes good business sense. Because at the end of the day, one of the things we've often said with respect to our whistleblower program, the last thing any company wants is have the regulator knocking on their door and learning about something that they could have found out about, stopped, and fixed much earlier. And we also have at the Ontario Securities Commission a credit for cooperation sort of program, recognizing that there is misconduct out there and good corporations can identify it, fix it, come forward, and then they will get credit for that. So certainly I think there is certainly a benefit to not only having a good, effective program, but also revisiting and making sure it maintains its effectiveness.
This is great. This is really some really good examples of how the private sector is doing stuff that other people can follow. Thank you. Ange, we're ready for the next question.
Yeah, the next question, an attendee says, happy to hear about the SEC cases, positive direction. For family caregivers in long-term care who speak up, there is no protection, although lots of legislation to pretend we are doing something. How can we make the lives of elders and their caregivers easier by adopting strict regulation? How can we replicate it in other forums?
That's really a very important question, and I'm going to do a little bit of that one myself if you guys don't mind. Some of us actually testified at the Ontario long-term care inquiry into this kind of issue, and there was an incredible report that was put out about carers in the long-term care system during this is the post-COVID investigation, and there was such terror amongst the employees that they found family members coming forward, family members of the carers coming forward and insisting on anonymity because they were so scared that if they were identified, that the employee might be identified and they might lose. And it's a heartbreaking report that was put forward. And at the end of the day, the commission actually went back to the government and said, we can't continue our hearings unless we can allow these people to testify anonymously. So I have absolutely agree that there's a really important case in healthcare and long-term care because the evidence is there from the past and ongoing that there are things that go wrong, and many for-profit organizations which aren't looking for ways to improve the system. They're looking for ways to make more profit. So I think that I have made a few attempts to try and make a difference in that industry, and they weren't effective at all. Part of the reason for this conversation is we need people to stand up and say, you know what, we need to do this. the CFE is here to help. There's lots of other people that are here to help. You've heard experts on this panel saying we help people all the time. There's lots of ways that we can make it work, but it's very difficult to drive this down people's throats. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that one.
I'll jump in a different direction, Sandy, and like on the point in terms of thinking how it might work. One of the things that I've admired about some other jurisdictions where they do have legislation in place that is public interest disclosure related. So it's kind of like an umbrella piece of legislation that is sitting there. And some of these jurisdictions have had these in place for a lot of years, such that they've looked at ways to improve them going forward. So it might apply, for example, naturally to an employee, but in some jurisdictions they've made it also a conscious choice to apply it to, for example, volunteers in organizations. And I think that that's the kind of thing that we also need to be thinking about is the idea that in a public interest disclosure that occurs, you shouldn't need to fit sort of sweetly into, a particular category in order to be able to report or have respect of the system back to protect you from the report that you're making. We need those voices to count. We need that to be part of how we keep Canadians safe. So I think that's something else that we can aspire to do by looking at what some other jurisdictions have done in terms of creating legislation that will allow many different Canadians to find themselves in that space, know where to turn, how to report, what they'll hear back, and what their protections might be. It is a very serious situation, like you mentioned, 100%. Anybody that's been through long-term care knows what the whole thing is about, and it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to go through, and so understood how it would even have been so much worse through COVID. 100%.
I love that idea, and I know I keep throwing you these big questions. Is there, the idea that there might be ways to come out with a framework? Is there even a vague hope that we could pull something together like that, or we should be talking to people about that? Something that would override the federal provincial thing because it was public interest?
Yeah, so personally, I'm hopeful, and I remain hopeful, and I think it's because I have seen over time. You've been working at this much longer than I, but in the time frame that I've been involved, which is now many years, I've sort of noted that there's more and more of a willingness to recognize the value of having provisions around whistleblower elements in pieces of legislation that are being introduced. And I'm speaking at the federal level, and obviously there are things that are going on at the provincial level as well. So, I think there's a way with the momentum in the private sector, which is one of the things that we're all here talking about here tonight. It shows the success that can come out of this for Canadians and for Canada. And I think if we take that and we're able to demonstrate the goodness that can come from this, it bears well for what we can do at a public level in terms of legislation. I think leading would be something that the federal government could certainly look to do in terms of framing what it may consider to be overarching. But you really do have to have this matching of the provincial legislation to it. Otherwise, as I mentioned, you can get the gaps that we know already exist. And the other thing I'd just like to say about that is that we're not the only jurisdiction in the world that has experienced that. Australia went through this. And one of the things that Australia did was reflected on, discrete pieces of legislation. I think it was corporate legislation at the time, but they reflected on the legislation that was existing in each individual state in Australia, only to find that there were gaps between them. And they went through a process then of basically trying to eliminate the gaps and get to a point of more harmonization within these processes that were built into legislation. So again, I sort of say, if you're looking for the pathways forward, I think you can find examples of how you can move an inch on them. And this will be a journey, because none of this is small business. This is hard work to make these kinds of changes happen for Canada, but I think they would certainly pay off. And I think the wherewithal of the private sector momentum that exists is one of the ways in which we can encourage the movement to happen on a legislative front. So, and I think that's exactly what you are trying to do. And I think we here are right behind you saying that's a good idea.
Thank you. Thank you. Ange.
Yeah, the next question, an attendee says, Sandy mentioned that some countries have whistleblower laws that apply to both the public and the private sector. Is that a direction that Canada and the provinces should take for both their own public employees and the private sector organizations which are within their jurisdiction?
So I'm going to make a ruling here. I've seen some of the other questions. This is an interesting question. I think that what Michelle has said, and the reason that we're all here, is because we are seeing green shoots. We are seeing progress in the private sector. We're showing that there are ways to do this. And if you look at the CFE and Ian Braun and David Hutton have reviewed every single public sector law in the country, and they all fail. It's on our website. Go have a look at it. The most frustrating thing about it is that after a process that's taken 3 or 4 years, we're still barely even getting those governments to engage with us, never mind try and come out with a better law. And so we're not dropping all of that. We're just changing the channel, saying that's fine. You've got all of that. You've got to think about that for a bit. We're going to work over here because we've got a bunch of people over here that've got great ideas. They're putting them into practice and they're working. Is there something that could work over both? My personal view, let's hear what the panel say. My personal view is that there is such structures and restrictions built into everything that we've got in the public sector. All of the things that the Ontario law did, said, get rid of this, get rid of these tight definitions, just broaden it all out. You've got to start again. I don't think it could happen without starting again. There's another question I do want to get to, but does anyone have another thought about that?
No, I think Sandy, you're right. I think just with the number of bureaucracies within the public sector, it's going to be very hard to have something that covers both private and the public sector. And I almost think that needs to be tailor-made for each of the sectors.
Right. Ange, there's a question that I can see here at the top from Scott about initiatives for sharing best practices. Would you mind reading that one for the audience? Because I think that really speaks to the point we are at in this conversation.
Yeah, that was actually my next one in line.
Yeah.
The next question from Scott. There don't seem to be any initiatives where governments are sharing best practices. Are you aware of any platforms, pilot programs, conference work groups, etc., where private sector players are sharing knowledge, challenges, and best practices with the goal of advancing whistleblower law and the policies and protections in their respective sectors?
Dear panel, you know that I have an opinion, but I'd like to hear what you think.
Maybe I'll start first. There are informal, like for the private sector, for us, there are informal organizations like we started the Montreal Integrity Network, where we have different businesses within Montreal to join and talk about integrity issues and how do we handle obstacles that comes our way. I have discussions with peers from my industry, other engineering firms, construction firms, mining firms on a regular basis to share ideas and talk about war stories as much as we can talk about our war stories to sort of share ideas on how to tackle some of the things. So those are some of the informal things that we have in place to make sure that there is knowledge sharing between companies in the private sector.
Sandy, I'll jump in and just say that, stating the obvious, it's one of the reasons that I'm here this evening and why I'm part of this movement at CFE is that I think it's incredibly important that we're having these conversations. This is what needs to happen, and it's through the sharing of experiences and ideas that you get momentum, whether it's private sector or public sector. It's also one of the reasons that we undertook that piece of research that we did with the International Federation of Accountants and also Whistleblowing International Network. And at the end of that document that Ange and Sandy have both indicated would be a resource document for you, the annex at the back is a compendium of the 14 best practices that we were able to identify, practice principles that we were able to identify from the sweep of the globe at the point that we did this. So it's good information, I think, basis of looking at it. And then when you talk about specific examples in companies and such, I think the forums that Dave is referring to are invaluable to hear what others are experiencing in similar sectors, especially, would be very useful.
Right.
And I'll be very brief, Sandy. I think there should be more. I think there's lots of opportunities there, and I certainly think there are great organizations out there that have a lot to share. I think part of the issue might be is a cultural thing. I mean, certainly, I think there are I see and hear a lot of opportunities in the U.S., and they've had a strong, robust culture of whistleblowing going way back to the Civil War, if you will. Whereas I don't think we necessarily have as strong a whistleblower culture in terms of protecting and bolstering and making more robust support here. So in short, I think there should be more.
Yeah.
Great. And as Michelle has said, the purpose of us setting up this private sector whistleblower working group is exactly to do this. And our experience and view is that there is no centralized activity here. There are people trying. Transparency International does a bit. We work with TI a lot here, but they have said, look, in light of your level of expertise of your group on whistleblowing, go ahead and do the whistleblowing one. And we're doing that with partners. They're a sponsor tonight. Win is a sponsor tonight. So in this country, this is one of the spots where we're trying to do exactly this. And some of the materials we're going to share with you at the end, I think will help you on that journey. Ange, I don't know whether we've got time for one more question or whether we need to bring Jim back in.
No, we have some more time. The next question is from David. David says, as mentioned, whistleblowers mostly report up through their line management. How do you deal with the situation where the line management are likely to be hostile? For example, because they are implicated in the wrongdoing or just unwilling to hear bad news?
Yeah, I'll take that first, and then so we actually have a policy that's duty to report policy that stipulates there's various channels of raising concerns, right? Obviously, you know, the first sort of level of raising it is to your immediate manager, and obviously, if you're the reporter, you can sort of decide, hey, my report my allegation is actually pertaining to my manager. I can't really talk to him. So there are various different channels, including, again, as I said, we've got the reporting line. We've got integrity ambassadors that we've nominated for each of the offices around the world. We've got integrity officers for each of the sectors that we operate in, and obviously HR. And legal as well. So having multiple channels of reporting is the way to go. You know, people that sort of based it on having just a hotline to make the report, I don't think that will work. You'd have to have multiple channels to report things.
Right. And if I
Agreed.
may, any good program will have the ability through anonymous reporting, through senior level incident report contacts, and a range of other things to work around exactly this problem. This is what the protected channel is for. I've done 2 cases with large organizations in this country where the whistleblower made cases against the most senior, the founder, the chairman, the owner, the whole 9 yards. And we were able to bring both of those cases to a satisfactory conclusion. It can be done. No one's pretending for a moment that that's what happens all the time. Bad attitudes and bad practices abound. But what we are saying is that there are ways that it's happening and people are doing it. And the knowledge about how to do it right is out there. We've just got to keep spreading the message as well. Michelle or Andre, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just think in terms of, we've all sort of touched upon it throughout, it goes without saying, you know, tone from the top and culture. And we talk about line managers, we talk about middle management and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, the messaging comes from the top. And if there is a problem at that level, it's likely because it hasn't necessarily filtered through from the top. As you mentioned, Sandy, you've had some successes with respect to those senior individuals. That's, I think, where it really has to start.
Right.
My comment would just be it's on to Dave's point, but it's options, right? It's having options available to a whistleblower. You know, I'm just going to say that not everybody will relate to the same option the same way as the next person. Somebody may prefer to, you know, have something much more in person. The next person wants to be completely using technology. It can go any different way, and they're motivated and they feel like they have to be heard in the way that is comfortable to them. So I think if you're designing a program with options in mind, you're doing your best to enable the whistleblower to come to you when they're ready.
That's great. I really like that point, and I teach that to all of our clients, is that you need to offer them choice. You know, we all see things and do things and hear things and feel things in different ways, options. Excellent. Ange?
Another question from an attendee. Do you think the wider use of monetary rewards for whistleblowers would encourage more people to speak up, or would it be counterproductive?
Well, oops. Oh no. What have I done?
We can still see you and hear you, Sandy.
That's great. I've pressed the wrong button here. Very good. I'm going to quickly do that. We've got just a couple of minutes. Does anyone else want to have a crack at that one?
I'll probably have to declare a conflict on that one since we offer awards. So.
Yeah. I think what I would say is this. There are circumstances in America where you've got the key time laws and a history of doing it. It's a great program, right? And although in Canada there is quite a lot of folk that feel it's not right to pay whistleblowers, I think those of us that have worked with whistleblowers know that given the devastation that they experience and so on, they'll never work again, it's quite reasonable for that to happen. Having said that, I deal with whistleblowers, Dave deals with whistleblowers all the time, where there just isn't really a way in the average corporate setting. It's just not practical to have this kind of a program. So when you're dealing with governments and you're dealing with corruption, or you're dealing with public companies and you're trying to get those really big cases, there are ways to fund that, and that's great. And I'm a fan of that. But I don't think that that is a panacea for everything. Most of the whistleblowing in this country operates at a different level and in different environments where it's just not practical or possible to pay whistleblowers.
Yeah, and I would chime in, Sandy, and just say that from the international, certainly research work that we would have done, it's evident that there is not one answer to this question. Culturally, there are differences between jurisdictions that make it seem a different way. There are relative successes that can be seen with programs that have awards. There are other people that espouse not paying them. So it's one that it's kind of like the $64 million question. If you go around the globe and look for the right answer, you'll find different answers to it. So it's not just here in Canada that you're finding that there might be variations in response. But I think award to whistleblowers is the right frame of reference to think about any monetary compensation because of the cost of whistleblowing. It's the risk to report in the public interest is significant.
Great. Thank you, guys. You've been amazing. Thank you. Jim, I'm going to hand back to you.
My camera will come on. There we go. Thank you for handing it back. You stole my congratulations to the panel. Amazing. I think the four of you were really terrific, and it was informative and interesting. And I just want to thank you so much for participating with us tonight and sharing your experience and knowledge and advice. And I want to thank the audience for joining us this evening. I hope you found it worthwhile. A video of tonight's panel will be posted on the CFE website tomorrow. So if you have friends or colleagues who you think would enjoy this or learn from it, please feel free to check that out and share that with them. We also post, along with the video, a list of additional readings and resources for people who got inspired by this and want to dig deeper into it, or heard reference to various cases, as Andre was talking about others. We'll put links to those things and other resources up there, and we're going to ask the panelists for anything they recommend to be posted along that. So there'll be these additional resources that we hope you'll make use of too. So I want to thank the audience for coming tonight. I want to tell you about our next event, which is a very different one. It'll be a week from tonight at 7 o'clock again, Eastern time. And it's as I say, a very different topic. It goes back to the work we do with journalists and media. The title of it is, "What does the Western media get wrong about the Middle East?" Now, that could be a very long conversation, but we have three of the world's really experienced international journalists who are going to be addressing that, who've worked in the Middle East for years and deal with this complex question, which is really quite relevant in our world today. So if you're interested in that, join us next week on Thursday at 7 o'clock, same place. And to get To find the video for this session and the additional reading and resources, our website is cfe.torontomu.ca. cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Well done,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.